Welcome to another discussion of medical ethics. This time around, we're going to be spending some time with a chapter from this book, A Very Short Introduction to Medical Ethics by Michael Dunn and Tony Hope, second edition. And the issue that we're going to be exploring is what Dunn and Hope call culture, consent, and community. Or more broadly speaking, we're going to be thinking about the question of what Western imperialism is and how it might be avoided in the context of healthcare and medical research. So here's the plan. We'll talk about medical research regulations and the concept of Western imperialism. We'll think about consent as it applies to international medical research, and we'll learn about the idea of community advisory boards as a possible practical solution. And then we'll finish up by thinking about other problems related to international medical ethics. So let's think about regulations on medical research. 1946, the Nuremberg Code was developed. You may well know 1946 is right in the aftermath of the Second World War. Nuremberg is a place in Germany. And this was a set of regulations on medicine and research that had to be instituted after more and more of the atrocities surrounding the Holocaust were made apparent. And one thing that emerged is that a great deal of horrifying medical research was done by doctors working for the Nazis. In many cases, there were, for instance, twin studies, done without the consent of any of the families, and which often led to great harms to the research subjects. And in 1963, the Declaration of Helsinki is ratified, again, placing certain regulations on medical research. And the Declaration of Helsinki is still in operation. It was updated on its 50th anniversary at 2013. And in both the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, we have certain values being focused on. So things like respect for patient autonomy, protecting patients from risk of harm, making sure that research is valuable and of high quality. And we can also think about making sure that justice is protected. So we can think about how, in many cases, the sorts of research being done by Nazis, clearly it was harming patients and against their autonomy, a violation of their rights and exploitative, so we can see it as an injustice. We might also notice that a lot of the research done by Nazi scientists, even though it did develop some practices that are still in use today, much of the research was shoddy. That is to say, it was often unclear what control groups were being used. It was often the case that the bad ideology behind the racism of these studies also motivated bad research. We can also see these kinds of principles were violated in U.S. situations. So if we track back and think about the Tuskegee study, where about 400 poor black laborers had their syphilis left untreated to manage its, or to learn about its development, we might notice that there we also had a violation of patient autonomy in the way that the patients were lied to. They were certainly exposed to a great deal of harm. About a quarter of these men died as a result of not being treated. It was certainly exploitative. And it also seems that the research did not generate any valuable findings. In fact, the main thing that we need to know about syphilis that it can be treated early with penicillin is something that was already known early on in the study. So we need these sorts of regulations on medical research. Now, there have been criticisms of these regulations. If you ask any scientist or researcher out there working, they will probably tell you that working with internal review boards or ethics review boards at their universities can be frustrating at times. It certainly slows research. Sometimes it makes certain kinds of experiments impossible, and it's a lot of paperwork. So sometimes the way that these codes are applied can be a source of debate. It's also noted that the regulations on medical research are sometimes paternalistic. For instance, they don't allow research participants to willingly undertake certain risks. So there might be some patients who would be quite interested in participating in a study that might expose them to a certain amount of harm. But ethics codes require the patients not to be exposed to this kind of research, even though they're willing to undertake it. We can call this paternalistic, because paternalism is all about not allowing a person to act on their own judgment out of a concern for their well-being. Right? So that's a criticism of these sorts of codes. And a final one is that there is inconsistency. So some people say that there's a double standard going on because the amount of information and consent and double checking that researchers are required to give to research participants is a much more stringent standard than the kind of consent and information we have to receive and give to a standard patient. So this is yet another concern about current research regulations. Now, these debates about research regulations are often debates that happen within a single society. And in this way, we're going to say, like, this is a group of people trying to figure out how they're going to work out their social rules for doing research together. It gets a little more complicated when we move to an international context, because in this context, it's one group figuring out how they're going to treat another group. And this sometimes leads to the charge of Western imperialism. So roughly speaking, Western imperialism can be defined as when Western countries, and we're talking about largely Europe and North America, so we could be talking about the United States or Germany or Canada or France or England, imposing their particular values and moral rules onto other countries. And we do see this kind of thing seem to bubble up sometimes. So quoted on page 109 of our reading by Dunn and Hope, they find that the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine once said that human subjects in any part of the world should be protected by an irreducible set of ethical standards. So it seems that she is saying there are certain rules that apply to everybody, everywhere, no matter what. When we start to think about what these ethical rules might be, like beneficence and non-maleficence and respect for patient autonomy, we might worry that we're trying to treat local values as universal values. That's a big way in which the problem emerges. But we have this charge of imperialism. On the other hand, here's a thing that we can notice about the international world we live in and the international situation of medicine, is that there are many diseases in this world that affect countries that are least able to treat and research them. So, for instance, poorer countries in the non-Western world, whether we're dealing with somewhere in Asia like Cambodia, or whether we're dealing with places in Africa like Ghana or Kenya, they may be more affected by certain diseases like HIV or malaria or tuberculosis. Right, so these diseases are really big problems in these poorer non-Western countries. So this leads to what we might even call a possible paradox, right? It seems that we seem to have a duty to assist other countries that will benefit from medical research. It seems important that we help countries suffering from problems like malaria and tuberculosis to find medical solutions to those problems. But it also seems like we've got these universal research norms, like this editor of the New England Journal of Medicine was talking about. But it seems like we're also in a situation where we have a duty not to impose those values and practices on others. So it seems like we've got a bunch of competing values here. Now, with option A, we might follow the universal set of norms, but there's a concern that this might lead to imperialism. Option B, we might follow local standards. Well, that would help us not impose values, but we might fail by certain research norms. And option C, leave developing nations alone. That might be a way of avoiding imperialism, but then we end up failing in fulfilling our duty to help others in need. So it seems like there's something bad about all of these options, even though these options seem to be the straightforward solutions to the values that are listed above. So one way that we might see how this gets puzzling and practically difficult is by thinking about how consent in research works. So when we're thinking about the standard practice in the Western world, each individual participating in the research is going to be informed of the risks and benefits of the procedure, and if the would-be participant finds those risks to be ones worth taking, then they would consent and sign a piece of paper, a form, to signal that consent. But let's say we're doing malaria research in Kenya. We might encounter a couple of issues. One is that communicating the risks and benefits might not be the same procedure in Kenya, where we have different levels of medical knowledge, also different levels of literacy. But we might also notice that within cultural norms, rather than having an individual patient consenting to medical research, we might find that guidance from village elders or heads of families, like husbands within a household, is also what is the standard practice in that situation in Kenya. So in this way, it's suggested that maybe the Western norm of getting consent for research won't be applicable in a non-Western country. So it might be that we might not get the same kind of explicit consent to research participation in Kenya, but some researchers with the right kind of consultation might feel like it's still appropriate to proceed with the research. And here's the compromise in international research that Dunn and Hope find. They say that if we're not going to do the standard Western procedure, we need some kind of other engagement. So rather than simply doing it the Western way or simply doing things according to the local values, we have to find a way for the researchers to find a way to do the research that they can live with, but also to do the research in a way that will be satisfactory to the locals who are the subjects of this research. So the idea here is that there's an aim for collaboration when we have cross-cultural medical research being done. And Dunn and Hope flag this really important notion of a community advisory board. So this is going to be a matter of having meetings, and maybe meetings where not only the research subjects are involved, but also family members, maybe village elders, and the research team. And there's going to have to be collaborative discussion to make sure that there's a mutual understanding about what would be done in the research, and also about how it's going to be carried out. So what are the aims of these boards? Well, part of it is about tailoring and disseminating knowledge about how consent processes should operate. So it might be that in Ghana, certain conversations need to be had, but in Kenya, different conversations might need to be had based on different local values, different religious beliefs, and so on. So we need to make sure that the medical information is being communicated in a way that's appropriate. And there also needs to be enough exchange that we can learn about specific cultural concerns. So a really interesting bit of research that Dunn and Hope point to in this chapter is that there are some communities in Ghana who do not believe that it would be okay to have their bodily materials, especially their blood, taken from their bodies and then taken to another part of the world to be studied. Right? So if sending a patient's blood to an overseas lab is inappropriate, part of what can be done is find a more appropriate way of dealing with the matter by, for instance, setting up a lab where the blood can be studied within Ghana rather than shipping it across the world. Only with substantive conversation and collaboration are we going to realize that this sort of approach might be needed in that context. The researchers are needing to clarify and establish appropriate routes for recruitment. So how can we find the correct researchers to try out a new drug or a new treatment for a particular disease? And it might be not only having the researchers do this recruitment in the right way, but also bringing in members of the community to do the recruitment or to collect data and samples. And more broadly speaking, these aims can communicate a certain respect of the researchers for the communities that the patients are living in. And this is a way of giving the community the final say and giving them the right ways to say whether research is appropriate or not. So this is a practical solution to a philosophical paradox. When we realize that researchers have certain values and communities might have different values, we've got to find a way of creating a compromise and a meeting of the minds. And maybe compromise is even the wrong word, because we might think that everybody gets all the things that they need when collaboration is done well. So this is just one dimension of how bioethics might have some special issues to deal with in an international context. I think that there are other ethical concerns in the realm of international bioethics. So, for instance, medical volunteerism is a widespread practice, and sometimes it can be done in problematic ways. So, for instance, in a paper by Bauer, they write about a situation where Western travelers who happen to be medical professionals might travel to somewhere like Nepal, partly for a vacation, but partly to do volunteer medical work. And we find situations where there's an existing local health system where locals' skills were improving and confidence in the system was growing. Unsolicited help was being given by these international medical volunteers, which was in fact undermining previous achievements. And some of the criticisms were, for instance, ad hoc clinics would be set up along the trail, often near and I guess in competition with local facility, arrogance, assuming that Western medicine is superior, and in many ways offering one-shot solutions to health problems rather than something that's more sustainable and ongoing. So we can see that there are certain ways in which the Western urge to help can sometimes go quite badly. Now, I know of some people who have engaged in medical volunteerism themselves. So, for instance, my mom has done volunteer work with a charity that has done work in Kenya, among other places. And we don't necessarily need to think that all medical volunteerism is bad, but we want to make sure that it's collaborative and not a simple Band-Aid solution to problems. So one thing that my mom was doing was working with local nurses and giving classes on how to get a baby breathing after it's born. And you might think that that sort of medical volunteerism is perhaps appropriate because it has these elements of collaboration and it doesn't demonstrate arrogance as much as a willingness to provide valuable help. But the questions of how medical volunteerism can go wrong, how it can be done better, is certainly an important international question in bioethics that is worthy of further exploration. Here's another thing to flag. We might also talk about poverty and patents. So, for instance, there are certain drugs that have been developed by companies from the Western world, which are then not accessible to poor non-Western countries. In fact, we found stories about this in the context of the COVID-19 vaccine, that we may well have been able to get more people vaccinated and save more lives if companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson had not protected their patents on vaccines as aggressively as they did. Another recent story from 2023, you might know about the author and YouTuber John Green. Mr. Green has recently taken part in a campaign that convinced Johnson & Johnson, the drug company, to not renew their patent on a drug called bedaquiline. And bedaquiline is one of the most important drugs for fighting tuberculosis. And you may well know that tuberculosis is a treatable disease, but that still kills many, many, many people. About as many people as are killed by malaria each year. Right? But this is actually a happy story in that through campaigning and a lot of discussion, both in public and probably also behind closed doors, Johnson & Johnson was convinced to not renew their patent on this drug. And because of this, the price of bedaquiline decreased dramatically. But in this way, we can see that one thing that we need to focus on when we think about the international dimensions of bioethics is that money is a huge factor, especially when we're dealing with the relationship between rich nations and poor nations. We might think that there is a duty among the rich to help the poor, and there's a further duty of the rich to not unjustly exploit poorer nations. And we might think that we have an ethical advancement in a positive direction when a life-saving drug like bedaquiline is no longer patented beyond what a company should do. In the case of bedaquiline, the patent had already been in place for many years, and Johnson & Johnson was trying to renew the patent on the basis of the claim that they had updated the technology in subtle ways. This is a practice that's sometimes referred to as evergreening, trying to keep a patent permanent by making small changes to the drug. But I hope that these further examples just show all the many ways, or maybe not all the many ways, but a hint towards some of the many ways in which when we start to think about medicine not as just a local practice, but something that is practiced around the world among different communities with different values, we need to think about how we're going to navigate this world in a thoughtful and careful way. So that'll wrap up my discussion. Thanks for listening in today. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out. Take care.